Okay, good morning. Genesis chapter 10 is where we're going to pick up this morning. Last week we got to the end of Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 10 is a long list of funny names, and a lot of people like to skip over it, I'm sure, because it's just like, okay, who are these people and why are they even mentioned? And then there's a brief bit of narrative in Genesis chapter 11, and then starting in verse 10 in Genesis chapter 11 through the end of that chapter, another long list of funny names. We're not going to get a chance to get to Genesis chapter 11. I do talk a lot about Genesis chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 5 in my presentation, Wherefore Art the Begats. Almost forgot the name of it. It's been a while since I've delivered it. So let's just go ahead and read all the way through Genesis chapter 10 and just get a feel for what's going on here. I'm going to try to reserve commentary until we're going to come back to we're going to loop back around to the beginning of the chapter, and then I'll start annotating and commenting on this stuff. So I'm going to just try to read it straight through. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz, and Ripha, and Torgama. The sons of Javan were Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, and into the nations, their nations. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba, Havilah, Sabta, and Rama, and Sabteka. And the sons of Rehoboth were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod, and he became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh, and therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Accad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth and Calah, and Resin between Nineveh and Calah, and that is the great city. Mizraim became the father of Ludim, and Ananim, and Lehabim, and Naphutim, and Pathrusim, and Kazluhim, from which came the Philistines. Caphtorim, Canaan became the father, the Philistines, and Caphtorim. Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Arkite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite, and afterwards the families of the Canaanites were spread abroad. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, as you go toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem were Elam, and Ashur, and Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, and Hul, and Gether, and Mash. Arphaxad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Eber. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan became the father of Amodad, and Shelef, and here's a big one, Hazarmaveth, and Jerah, and Hadaram, and Uzal, and Diklah, and Opal, and Abimel, and Sheba, and Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. Now their settlement extended from Misha as you go towards Sephar on the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations. And out of these, the nations were spread upon the earth after the flood. Now there's a word that was repeated there, like 4 times in the last 2 verses. We see it the first time in verse 5. From these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. So twice in verse 5 we see the word nations mentioned. And then here in verses 31 and 32. So we've already got two mentions. These are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies, by their nations. And out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. So we have 5 mentions of the word nations. So is it any wonder that biblical scholars call this the table of nations? This is where all the nations of the world come from, or the world at that time. So let's take a look at these nations. Let's see who these, no doubt for some of you, some of these names sounded familiar, like Canaan, right? Everybody knows where Canaan is. If you've read any amount of Bible, you're probably familiar with the land of Canaan. It's present day Israel. The Romans called it Palestine. Well, let's start back in verse 1. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and the sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at each name in turn and see which people group came from each one of these guys. So Gomer is probably, so there's a lot of, like, for some of these it's kind of iffy. Scholars aren't quite sure about some of them. We have some pretty good ideas, like really solid knowledge of what nations these individuals fathered, but some of them are a little iffier than others. Gomer is thought to be the predecessor, or the patriarch of the ancient Cimmerians, 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 an Aryan group who conquered Urartu, or Armenia. This is also known as the region of Anatolia in eastern Turkey today. They're also mentioned in Ezekiel 38:6 as an ally of Gog, one of the armies that set themselves up against God. And Josephus himself, in his, I think it was in his Antiquities of the Jews, said that he mentions Gomer as being the father of he settled in Anatolia, Galatia, or Turkey. So right away we have the land of Turkey represented here, particularly the eastern part of that country. So the sons of Japheth were Gomer and then Magog. Well, who is Magog? Magog is identified with Lydia. Lydia is whose capital was Sardis. Remember, in the book of Revelation, there is a church in Sardis, and John the beloved, the Apostle John, wrote a letter to the church in Sardis, and this would be Western Turkey. So now we have Gomer in Eastern Turkey, and then we have Magog in Western Turkey. So the two brothers kind of went, basically in the same general vicinity, but they split and went up in that direction. Okay, so the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai. So who's Madai? Madai is the ancestor of the ancient Medes. You've no doubt heard of the Medes and the Persians. What was it? Was it Darius who was a Mede? Darius the First. Darius, the king of the Medes and the Persians. So the Madai, the Medes come from Madai, one of Japheth's sons. Javan is another one of Japheth's sons. He is mentioned in Isaiah 66:19. So take a flip over there. Hold your hand there in Genesis chapter 10 and flip over to Isaiah 66:19. You might be surprised to find out who this is. Depending upon your translation. So using the, if you've got a New International Version, does anybody have a New International Version? You'd like to read it to us? Anybody? I don't have one in front of me right now. No, nobody? Bueller? Anyone? Okay. All right, so Isaiah 66:19. In the NASB, it says, I will set a sign among them and will send survivors from them to the nations, Tarshish, Put, Lud, Meshech, Tubal, and Javan, to the distant coastlands that have neither heard my fame nor seen my glory, and they will declare my glory among the nations. If you're reading in the New International Version, Isaiah 66:19, instead of Javan, we'll say Greece. So Greece is comes from Javan. Javan. I have no idea how to pronounce these names. I just try to say it confidently so you think I know what I'm talking about. Likewise, in Ezekiel 27:13, if you're reading the New International Version, it will also translate that as Greece. And it's Javan is mentioned in several other places, like in Daniel and in Zechariah, but I won't bother to go there. Javan is also mentioned by Sargon II, who ruled from 721 to 705 BC in the Assyrian records as a result of a naval encounter with them. So Sargon II had a naval encounter with had an encounter with the navy of the predecessors of Greece, the Grecians. That would be Javan. They're a son of Japheth. Okay, who's next? Next on the list, Javan and Tubal. Tubal is thought to be the founder of the Tibarani, which is a Scythian tribe. So you remember there's a passage in the New Testament that talks about, therefore there's neither barbarian nor Scythian, slave nor free, but we're all one in Christ Jesus, right? So we talk about the Scythians. The Scythians, I believe, lived in the middle part of the modern day Turkey, if I remember correctly. Let's see here. So the Scythians, actually, they tended to spread out. It says in history, they're said to be the father of the Italians, the Spanish, and the Caucasian Iberians. So you remember, if you're not familiar with geography, the Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula that contains Spain and Portugal. So the Scythians are thought to have spread basically across across Europe, in that band right around there. So again, Italy. Where was it? Hello. Having a hard time reading my own handwriting. Okay, the Italians, the Spanish, and the Caucasian Iberians. So that would be the Spanish. And today, people from the land of Georgia, not the state, but the country of Georgia, claim to be the descendants from Tubal, Togarmah, and Meshech. Speaking of Meshech, that gets us down to the next one of Japheth's sons. Meshech, Herodotus places them in the mountains of the southeast of the Black Sea. And apparently they then later migrated north to Russia. And I found one source that said that Meshech was then kind of, depending upon what language you're speaking, there's a word called Moshi, M-O-S-C-H-I. I don't know if that's Moski. Moscow, the modern day city of Moscow, is said to come from Moshki, which is supposed to be from Meshech. So now we see, the people's Japheth's descendants kind of going even further up, further north. They're going beyond Turkey and beyond the region there up into the northernmost parts of what is now Russia. And he's said to have started the nation of Moski, wherever that is. All right, and then finally, Japheth's last son is Tiras, and he's thought to be the father of the Thracians. If you've heard of Thrace, T-H-R-A-C-E, the Thracians, which is roughly in the area of where Bulgaria is today. So what do these guys all have in common? Well, they tend to settle in, the very westernmost part of Asia and then getting up into Europe a little bit. So if you're pale-skinned like me, you're more than likely a descendant of Japheth, because my ancestors came from Germany and Sweden. And that's where Japheth's people kind of settled in there. All right, so we've covered the sons of Japheth were Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphtah and Togarmah. So who's Ashkenaz? The Ashkenaz are thought to be the Scythians, later in the Slavic areas, probably Yugoslavia and thereabouts. According to New Unger's dictionary, they were this is a direct quote, so these are not my words. I thought it was kind of funny. Quote, they were rude and they were a rude and retarded in civilization and periodically overran extensive territory so that their name came to be tantamount to barbarians, unquote. That's from the New Unger's Bible dictionary. I thought that was pretty funny. So the Ashkenaz were basically the barbarians. They were rude and retarded in civilization. I thought it was pretty funny. The medieval Jews associated this term with the Rhineland of Western Germany. So I had prior to doing this study, I had heard of the Ashkenazi Jews, but these are Jews who were living in the Rhineland in Germany. I'm not sure that there's a direct correlation there between the two. Okay, Ashkenaz, and then his brother Riphtha. We don't know anything about him. I couldn't find any information about Riphtha, so he's pretty much lost to history, other than his brief mention here in Genesis chapter 10. Togarmah, he is his descendants are primarily merchants who trafficked with Tyre in horses, war horses, and mules, and we learned that from Ezekiel 27:14. Wasn't really able to find out a whole lot about Togarmah either. Okay, and so that takes care of Togarmah. That's verse 3. Now, verse 4. The sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Well, one of those names I remember from the VeggieTales movie, you know, Jonah. But we'll get there in a second. Elisha is possibly settled in Cyprus. Ezekiel 27:7 tells us that Elisha was the source of purple dyes. So they had a lot of purple. They were known for their purple dyes there, possibly in the northern part of the Isle of Cyprus. Secondly, his second son, Tarshish, right? Nobody really knows where Tarshish is. There are some guesses that maybe he, you know, because remember when Jonah was called to go to Nineveh. So let's see here. So here's a little slice of Israel. I'm trying to do this backwards. So this would be the Mediterranean Sea as you're looking at it. And so, you know, Jonah lived somewhere here in the, you know, near the coastline, I guess, in Israel. And then he was told to go to Nineveh, which would have been up here. And what did he do? Well, we have all seen the VeggieTales movie. We know that he said he wanted to go to Tarshish, which was the opposite end of the world, basically. He wanted to go as far away as he could from Nineveh. So he went to Joppa, boarded a boat, and then he went across, tried to get to the Mediterranean as far away from Nineveh as he could possibly get. Where was that? We're not entirely sure. I remember when James Hansen was our pastor, and I took a class from him many years ago. He thought that it was perhaps on the western coast of Spain. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. And if you think about it, if you're in Israel, hang on, I'm going to mute myself because I gotta do something about this. Whew, rough morning. Okay, he thought it was on the west coast of Spain, which would make a lot of sense. If you're trying to, you know, God tells you to go north and east, then the best, you know, how do you get away from him? Well, you go as far west as you can. You don't want to go that direction. So we don't really know where Tarshish went. Tarshish was. Some people say Spain. Some people think it might be Sardinia, which is off of the western coast of Italy, the northwestern coast of Italy. But ultimately, nobody really knows for sure. We haven't found any archaeological evidence to really nail that place down. Okay, Kittim is also possibly Cyprus, or maybe the Macedonians. And then Dodanim is Illyricum, or Troy, again over there by Greece and modern-day Macedonia. So the sons of Javan were Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Now, I want to point something out here. You don't really see this pointed out. You say, you know, each one according to their language, but we know that the earth was divided by its languages in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, right? That's the Tower of Babylon story. So what is it talking about here? It says according to the languages, because chapter 11, verse 1 says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east. They found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. So I think what's going on here is that I remember hearing an explanation of this once, that the languages that we're talking about in Genesis chapter 10 was really just dialects. So each family had its own, unique dialect. They could still communicate with one another. They're still speaking the same language, but they had different dialects. It's kind of like, somebody from the suburbs trying to talk to somebody in the inner city. Can they communicate with one another? Yeah. Some of the words, some of the slang they use may be different, and maybe some difficulty in understanding, idioms and whatnot. But for the most part, their languages were the same. Okay, chapter 10, verse 6. Now, we move on from Japheth to Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. Well, who are these sons? Well, Cush is thought to be modern-day Ethiopia. Now, I did read an article, where I'm going to read you an article about Nimrod when we get down to him, wherein it says most scholars think that Cush was actually in Shinar, which would be the plain around in the Mesopotamian area. But so there's some disagreement about what happened there. They think some people say that maybe what Cush did was he originally settled there, and then later he moved down into the Ethiopian or northern Sudan region. So a lot of this is just kind of again, it's a little bit sketchy. But from most sources I've been able to see, I've been able to say that Cush is modern day Ethiopia, or maybe perhaps northern Sudan. Mizraim, this is a lot easier, because there's a nation today whose inhabitants call it Mizr, M-I-S-R, when it's transliterated into English, and that nation is Egypt. So whenever you see Mizraim in the Bible, you can just insert Egypt in there, and that's exactly who it's talking about. Mizraim's brother was Put, or sometimes it's spelled P-H-U-T. I guess it's foot, kind of like phone, right? That would be modern day Libya, we think. And then of course Canaan, and we all know where Canaan is. That's modern day Israel. That's where the nation of Israel is today. Okay, verse 6, the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. Verse 7, the sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, and Sabta, and Reamah, and Sabteka, and the sons of Reamah were Sheba and Dedan. Okay, who are these guys? Sheba, or Seba, we think is the predecessor to the Sabians. You've probably heard those from ancient Near East history. Perhaps they lived in the southern Arabian Peninsula, that area. Havilah perhaps lived in northern Arabia. Again, many perhapses, because we're not absolutely sure. Sabta seems to be the predecessor, or the patriarch of the Somalis from Somalia. Reamah is usually assumed to be around the area of modern-day Yemen. And Sabteka is southern Arabia and Yemen, so they probably, they're brothers, so they probably camped out close to each other. You notice that what happens is, that all the Japhethites, kind of went up north, and they kind of spread out from there. And Ham kind of went down south from the mountains of Ararat down into what we would call, modern day Arabia and the plain of Shinar, and kind of sneaking down into Africa. A lot of the Hamites moved to Africa, it looks like. Sheba was known for, what does that say? Oh, unknown for sure. We're not exactly sure where Sheba is. You remember the Queen of Sheba went up to visit King Solomon, and she brought with her many magnificent gifts. She wanted to hear about his magnificent wisdom and partake of that. But we're not exactly sure, but we think it's possibly southern Arabia again. So that the Arabian Peninsula seems to be, again, the Arabian Peninsula and northern Africa seems to be where the Hamites settled. And Dedan, we have no idea. I couldn't find anything about Dedan to figure out where he lived or where he settled. All right, now here's where things get a little more interesting. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, or before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Accad, the Akkadians, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth and Calah. and Resin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. All right, so Nimrod. I've been hearing about Nimrod since I was a kid, and in my extended family, if you did something stupid, my uncles would call you a Nimrod, and I had no idea. I had no exposure to the Bible whatsoever at this stage of my life, and all I knew is that if you were, a Nimrod was an idiot. So who is this Nimrod guy? And then, finally I opened the Bible, as a young man, and I read this and I go, Nimrod. Hey, I've heard that before. My uncles used to call me Nimrod all the time. So, what is this? Well, I look at this and you go, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. Okay, so he's a pretty kind of an important dude. He was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. He was really known for his hunting skills. And this is, undoubtedly before, I don't think they had, they hadn't discovered gunpowder back then. And, he's out there hunting, I don't know, maybe with his bare hands, maybe with a knife, bow and arrow, whatever he's got. But he was known as a mighty hunter. And then I discovered this article that originally appeared in the summer 2001 issue of Bible and Spade magazine. It's a biblical archaeology magazine. I found it at biblicalarchaeology.org. If I remember, I'll put a link in the description box down below. And I want to read you some excerpts from this article. It was written by David Livingston. It says PhD. I have no idea what his PhD is in. Hopefully, presumably it's in something relevant to the field here. Let me read you some select passages from this thing. It's rather interesting. It says, the best known ancient Mesopotamian heroes of the Mesopotamian ancient heroes, Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk in southern Mesopotamia. His story is known in the poetic Gilgamesh epic, but there is no historical evidence for his exploits in the story. So you may have heard of the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic is often raised by skeptics as one of these, it's a story that's older than, it's older than the Bible. And this is supposed to be where Moses got his flood, where his flood story came from, right? So Moses lifted the story, and it's just a retelling of an old story. And the Gilgamesh epic is really what happened. And so people try to use that as a way to say, that the Bible is not true and authentic. It's just a retelling of an older story. So, but this guy named Gilgamesh was one of their great heroes, and we'll see that his heroic exploits weren't so heroic. Well, not from a godly perspective anyway. So, was Nimrod godly or evil? First of all, what does the name Nimrod mean? The name Nimrod comes from the Hebrew verb marad, meaning rebel. Adding an N before the M becomes an infinitive construct. So Nimrod. So therefore, the meaning of his name is the rebel. That's interesting. But when we start reading it, it gets more and more interesting. So thus, Nimrod may not actually be this guy's his name after all. It is more likely a derisive term of a type or representative of a system that is epitomized in a rebellion against the Creator, the one true God. Interesting. So he's a rebel. So in Genesis 10, 8 through 11, we learn that Nimrod establishes a kingdom, and we see that it's the kingdom of Babylon. So this is the, that the Bible has really nothing good to say about Babylon throughout all the pages, right? From the first to the last, there's nothing good to be said about Babylon. So how is it this guy's a mighty hunter before the Lord? And it seems the Bible seems to be talking about him in somewhat, it appears to be positive terms, right? He's a mighty hunter before the Lord. What could be wrong with that, right? Well, let's keep reading. So according to the Gilgamesh of Epic, there was a flood that was sent upon the earth. And according to the story, Huwawa was killed. Huwawa was the being that sent the flood. Huwawa, say that out loud a couple times. Huwawa was killed by Gilgamesh and his half-man, half-beast friend Enkidu. The author of this paper, the authors suggest Huwawa is the ancient pagan perspective of Yahweh. Yahweh, Huwawa. Yeah, I can get that. The God of the Bible. So then he goes on to say, the date of the composition of the Gilgamesh epic can therefore be fixed at about 2000 BC, but the material contained on these tablets is undoubtedly much older, as we can infer from the mere fact that the epic consists of numerous originally independent episodes, which, of course, did not spring into existence at the time of the composition of our poem, but must have been current long before they were compiled and woven together to form our epic. So this is talking about a really, really old story here. We think that Abraham lived around 2000 BC, right? So the time that these tablets were put together was right around the time of Abraham's walking the earth. As we get into the story, we find out that Gilgamesh was a vile, filthy man, yet the myth says of him that he was 2/3 God and 1/3 man. Not sure how you get thirds, but alas, that's what they say. The Babylonian flood story is told on the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, almost 200 lines of poetry on 12 clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform script. A number of different versions of the Gilgamesh epic have been found around the ancient Near East, most dating to the 7th century BC, or around the 700 BCs, right? The most complete version came from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Commentators agree that the story comes from a much earlier period, not too long after the flood, as described in the story. So how does the Gilgamesh epic compare? How does Gilgamesh compare with Nimrod? Well, Josephus, the first century Roman historian who is of Jewish descent, has this to say about Nimrod in his Antiquities of the Jews. Now it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength of hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe it to God, as if it were through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. In other words, God doesn't bring you joy, it's you. You bring yourself joy. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God but to bring them to a constant dependence upon his own power. Oh my goodness. Does that speak to our current political situation today? Some people would like, they don't want you to be independent. They want you to be dependent upon the government and constantly dependent upon them to provide everything you need. Whew, that'll preach right there. He also said that he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to be able to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. Again, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. In another site, it says, two of the premier commentators in the Bible in Hebrew has this to say about Genesis 10:9. Nimrod was mighty in hunting, and that in opposition to Yahweh. Not before Yahweh in the sense of according to the will and purpose of Yahweh, still less in a simply superlative sense. The name itself, Nimrod, from Marad, we will revolt, points to some violent resistance to God. Nimrod was a mighty hunter, founded a powerful kingdom, and the founding of this kingdom is shown by the verb with consecutive, to have been the consequence or result of his strength in hunting. So that hunting was intimately connected with the establishment of the kingdom. Hence, if the expression a mighty hunter relates primarily to hunting in the literal sense, we must add to the literal meaning the figurative signification of a hunter of men, a trapper of men by stratagem and force, perhaps slavery. Nimrod, the hunter, became a tyrant, a powerful hunter of men. And that was from Keel and Delitzsch. Another source says, in the face of Yahweh can only mean in defiance of Yahweh, as Josephus and the Targums understand it. And the proverb must have arisen when other daring and rebellious men followed in Nimrod's footsteps, and must have originated with those who saw in such conduct an act of rebellion against the God of salvation. In other words, with the possessors of the divine promise of grace. So it starts to get a little more interesting once you find out who this Nimrod guy was, right? He wasn't a mighty hunter before the Lord. He was a mighty hunter in opposition to the Lord. Our English translation of the Hebrew of Genesis 10, 8 through 10 is weak, the article goes on to say. The author of this passage of scripture will not call Gilgamesh by his name and honor him, but is going to call him by a derisive name, what he really is, a rebel. Therefore, we should translate Genesis 10, 8 through 10 to read as follows. This is interesting. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a tyrant in the earth. He was a tyrannical hunter in opposition to the Lord. Thus it is said, Nimrod, the tyrannical opponent of Yahweh. The plot thickens. Gilgamesh confronts Yahweh. The name Yahweh, YHWH, the Tetragrammaton, rarely appears in extra-biblical literature in the ancient Near East. Therefore, we would not expect to find it in the Gilgamesh epic. But why should the God of the Jews rarely be mentioned? It's a good question, right? It's not like no other nation had interaction with the Jews and with his God, right? The Jews went in there and wiped out a whole bunch of people. So people knew what was going on. They got, news traveled fast there. The Hebrew Bible is replete with the names of other gods. On the other hand, the nations surely knew of him even though they had no respect for him. If so, how might his name appear in their literature, if at all? The name of Yahweh in a culture which is in rebellion against his rule would most likely be in a derisive form, not in its true form. Likewise, the writers of Scripture would deride the rebels. So now it says, putting the Bible and the Gilgamesh epic together. And this is where it gets really interesting to me. Sorry if this is boring you, but I find this kind of stuff fascinating. It's always fun when you can see how you hear stories, from outside the Bible, and then you hear, you read the stuff in the Bible, and you wonder, how does what I read here in the Bible fit into what's going on in the world around them, right? Because the Bible seems to be focused pretty much in this little area of the world, but doesn't really talk a lot about, current events that are swirling around at the same time. So it's really fun for me to see a connection in between these two, and it's like, wow, you can now really start to see the biblical narratives and their place in history, in world history. So it goes on to say, the Gilgamesh epic describes the first God is dead movement. Okay, Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't the first one to say God is dead. This goes all the way back to the Gilgamesh epic. In the epic, the hero is a vile, filthy, perverted person, yet he is presented as the greatest, strongest hero that ever lived, so that the one who sent the flood wilt not trouble them anymore. Gilgamesh sets out to kill the perpetrator, so sets out to kill God, sets out to kill Yahweh. Takes with him a friend who is a monstrous half-man, half-animal Enkidu, and therefore, together, they go on a long journey to the Cedar Mountain to find and destroy the monster who sent the flood. Gilgamesh finds him and finally succeeds in cutting off the head of this creature whose name is Huwawa. Is there a connection with the Gilgamesh epic in Genesis 10? Note what Gilgamesh says to Enkidu, the half-man, half-beast, who accompanied him on his journey, found in Tablet 3, lines 147 to 150. This is cool. This is fun. If I fall, Gilgamesh says, I will establish a name for myself. Gilgamesh is fallen, they will say, in combat with terrible Huwawa. But the next 5 lines are missing from all the tablets found so far. All of them. All the tablets they found, the next 5 lines are missing. Can we speculate on what they say? Let's try. We suggest that those 5 lines include, quote, but if I win, they will say, Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Huwawa. So let's put them together. If I fall, Gilgamesh says, I will establish a name for myself. Gilgamesh is fallen, they will say, in combat with terrible Huwawa. But if I win, they will say, Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Huwawa. Well, why do we say that? Because Genesis 10:9 gives us the portion missing from the Gilgamesh tablets. Those lines include, it is said, Nimrod, or Gilgamesh, the mighty vanquisher of Yahweh. This has to be what is missing from all the clay tablets of the Gilgamesh story. The Gilgamesh epic calls him Huwawa. The Bible calls him Yahweh. So he concludes by saying, Because of the parallels between Gilgamesh and Nimrod, many scholars agree that Gilgamesh is Nimrod. Continuing with Gilgamesh's fable, he did win, he did vanquish Huwawa and took his head. Therefore, he could come back to Uruk and other cities and tell the people not to worry about Yahweh anymore. He is dead. I killed him over in the Lebanon mountains. So just live however you like. I will be your king and take care of you. There are still other parallels between the Bible and the Gilgamesh epic. Yahweh has a somewhat similar sound to Huwawa. Gilgamesh did just as the sons of God in Genesis 6 did. The sons of God forcibly took men's wives. The epic says that is precisely what Gilgamesh did. The Bible calls Nimrod a tyrant, and Gilgamesh was a tyrant. There was a flood in the Bible. There was a flood in the epic. Cush is mentioned in the Bible, Kish in the epic. Erech is mentioned in scripture. Uruk was Gilgamesh's city. Gilgamesh made a trip to see the survivor of the flood. This was more likely Ham than Noah, since Nimrod was Ham's grandson. Historically, Gilgamesh was the first dynasty of Uruk. As Jacobson points out, kings before Gilgamesh may be fictional, but not likely. The fact that the Gilgamesh epic also contains the deluge story would indicate a close link with events immediately following the flood. Wow. And so he wraps up with saying, you know, what a contrast Psalm 2 is with the Gilgamesh epic. And I'll read his quotation of Psalm 2 here. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers gather together against Yahweh, against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them, then rebukes them from his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of Yahweh. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way, for his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. That is fascinating. I'd heard people talk about this in the past, but never really bothered to look into it. And it's amazing when you see, you keep hearing, Epic of Gilgamesh, Epic of Gilgamesh. Well, who was it? Well, it's very likely Nimrod. And we've got him here, right here in the pages of Scripture. And I also want to draw a contrast here to you. You say, Nimrod was the founder of the first great nation, after the flood anyway. And it says, go back here to verse 8, it says, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech, and Accad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And from that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth at Calah and Resin between Nineveh and Calah, and that is the great city. So one thing you want to take notice of, he founded a city based upon his skills as a hunter, but that is the exact opposite of what God called the kings of Israel to be. So really quick, flip over to 2 Samuel. What did God call a godly king to be? 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 2. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And Yahweh said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. Flip over to chapter 7, verse 7. Wherever I have gone with all the sons of Israel, did I speak a word with one of the tribes of Israel, which I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Again, they're called to be a what? A shepherd. And then 1 Peter 5:4. Flip back there. I think this will be our last verse. Where is it? 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 4. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So see, Gilgamesh or Nimrod set up his kingdom based upon violence, based upon his ability to hunt men, and he stood in vile opposition to Yahweh, the God of all creation. But God calls godly leaders to be shepherds, to guide the flock, not to rule over them, not to beat them down, not to suppress them with violence, but to shepherd them, to care for them. The shepherd, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep, right? God does not rule over us, his people. He loves us, and he guides us, and he lays down his life for us that we might live and have life more abundantly. It is now 9:48. It's 12 minutes to the hour of 10 o'clock, and I am going to wrap it up there so we can close in prayer. I want to thank you so much for joining me these last few months in the midst of Corona apocalypse, and I want to thank you, and I pray that the Lord would guide you and direct you, give you peace, and that maybe we'll get a chance to do this again in person someday. So I'll turn off the recording here, and then we will